Hello, I am Aika, and this is the fifth Budget Watch webinar hosted by Rappler and iLEAD. Today we're going to talk about the proposed 2021 budgets for the environment and agriculture sectors. We're once again joined by Luis Abad, iLEAD's chairman of the board. Hello, Luis.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Aika. Let me just share my screen.
But for those who have joined this webinar just today, Luis has taken on different leadership challenges in civil society, government, and business. He has served as a student leader, policy analyst in the Philippine Senate, chief of staff to the Secretary of Finance, election campaigner, teacher, business development manager, and social entrepreneur. In each of these roles, Luis has worked to enhance civic engagement in politics and policy making, and to create more opportunities for shared prosperity. He is currently a part-time lecturer at the Economics Department and at the School of Government of Ateneo de Manila University. Hi, Luis. You have the screen.
Thanks, Aika. So just a brief intro on iLEAD. So iLEAD is a non-stock, non-profit think tank that really focuses on fiscal policy research. And now that we're discussing the national budget, or the budget is pending with Congress, part of our advocacy really is to increase awareness on the decisions being made, policy decisions being made through the national budget. So for today, we'll talk about the agriculture and environment budget. Just to start off, I wanted to share one of these articles that I read from McKinsey and Company, one of the major strategic consultancy companies. They identified, 5 key growth levers for ASEAN post-COVID. And relevant to our discussion today is that 2 of those are really basic and green infrastructure, so creating green and blue jobs, as well as building high-value food industries. So if we're looking at how will the new normal or the post-COVID economy look like, I think what McKinsey shared is a good guideline or guidepost that we can follow in trying to evaluate how are we preparing for life after COVID. So zooming in on the agriculture sector, I just wanted to share with our viewers today just a brief snapshot of the Philippines GDP in the last 2 decades. So as we can see, as services and industry, services has been growing the past 2 decades, industry relatively accelerating its growth in the 2010s, in the second decade of the 2000s. Agriculture, we see, has been left behind and has stayed below 2 trillion. And the share of GDP has actually gone down to, I think this is just around 10%. If we look at it from a growth rate point of view, it tells the same story. As we can see, industry, as services has been growing, industry accelerating in the second decade of 2000s, and agriculture really actually slowing down. However, to 2021, the recent GDP numbers we saw tells a different story. In the face of this historic recession, where services and industry went down, agriculture was the only sector that grew in the first half of 2020. Looking at it from its components, palay has been the number one value driver for Philippine agriculture for the past 2 decades and even before that. Livestock comes second, taking in 13%. This is the numbers from 2019. And then fisheries, poultry, and banana, and the rest of the other crops sharing below that. So you have their coconut, corn, sugarcane, pineapple, mangoes. So with that as the backdrop of the discussion on the budget for next year in its totality is equal to 4.5 trillion pesos. So this is an increase from the original 2020 budget of 4.1 trillion. But because of the pandemic that we faced, Congress has allocated additional funds for this year, and that has increased 2020's budget to 4.3 trillion. So next year's budget of 4.5 trillion is really 200 billion higher than the planned spending for this year. If we take a look at it from the agri-sector budget point of view, so what I included here was not just the DAE group of agencies, but also, cognizant that DAR, the Department of Agrarian Reform, also participates, also invests in the agriculture sector, as well as a lot of government-owned and controlled corporations that are linked to agriculture. So if you look at it from this point of view, what really jumps out is the increasing role of the government-owned and controlled corporations that are linked with the Department of Agriculture in terms of their share of the agri-sector budget. And this is, as we will see later, particularly driven by irrigation budgets with the National Irrigation Administration. So agri-budget in total, including all of its attached agencies, as you can see here in 2020, was increased due to the realignment. So originally, the 2020 budget for the agriculture group of agencies was 62 billion. With some of the realignments done by the Bayanihan 1 and 2, that has been increased to 72 billion. One of the biggest realignments is care of Bayanihan 2, which gives around 24 billion for financing and direct cash assistance. So for 2021, if you compare it with the original 2020 budget of 62 billion, there's a slight increase of 2 billion. But if you compare it with what is forecasted to be the overall agri spending for 2020, including all the realignments, it's going to be a decrease of 8 billion. So from 72 billion to 64 billion. The GOCCs under the agriculture sector more or less stays at its 50 plus billion levels. Aside from the budget allocations, what this chart also shows you is the actual disbursement, how much money has actually been used by these agencies with the budgets that they have. So for the DA group of agencies, the light blue is the disbursement level. So the disbursement has actually not, fully used up the budgets that they have. While the budgets range from, historically from 50 to 60, the actual disbursements are at the 30 to 40 level. And very noticeable for 2020 is that there's still a lot more room for spending with the remaining months in 2020. GOCCs, on the other hand, have actually accelerated their receipt of subsidies from the national government. So if we look at it from all the different agencies, if we disaggregate it, I guess the first observation one can make is that there's really a significant number of agencies and GOCCs involved in agriculture, more than the other sectors that we're seeing. And one of the biggest share, as we can expect, is the Department of Agriculture under the Office of the Secretary. So the main bureaucracy under the Agriculture Department. And it's the highest receiving agency for the agri-sector. As we can see in 2021, the share is increasing. That's because within the Department of Agriculture family in 2020, during this pandemic, there's been some realignments. So there was some amount taken away from the DA OSEC and given to the ACPC, or the Agricultural Credit Policy Council, through Bayanihan 2. There was a 24 billion realignment for financing and cash assistance. Of course, within the DA, they can realign that depending on how they decide on finally implementing this 24 billion financing or cash assistance program that was provided for by the legislature in Bayanihan 2. So that's why you can see the ACPC budget here kind of spiking in 2020 and then going back to its regular levels next year. After the Department of Agriculture Office of the Secretary, the second biggest recipient is the National Irrigation Administration. And then the third one will be the Department of Agrarian Reform, the main Office of the Secretary and the main bureaucracy of the DAR. Fifth is the NFA, National Food Authority. So despite the shift away from government importation, there continues to be significant budgets given to NFA for their buffer stocking operations. And the fifth agency is the Philippine Fisheries Development Authority. This is, PFDA is increasing its budget this year. In contrast to its historical levels, is because there are a number of port projects being assigned to the agency, causing it for the first time to have a higher budget than the main fisheries agency, which is the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources before. So there's been some movement in terms of how the budgets have been restructured among these different agencies. How that translates into actual outcomes or difference in actual implementation, we will have to see, and maybe some of our panelists would have some insights as to that. If we look at the agri-sector budget in terms of the programs that it runs, so the kind of initiatives that it invests in terms of the national government, the biggest investment is really in irrigation through the National Irrigation Administration. That's the purple line you're seeing at the top. So that will receive for next year around upwards of 30 billion pesos. After irrigation, the dotted red line is production support. So these are the contributions of the national government in inputs, seeds, fertilizer for the farmers, and that takes in the second biggest share in terms of programs. So that's a little less than 20 billion. The third is the DA locally funded projects. So this is quite interesting because it's something that is new in terms of the increase in share in the budget. And this is primarily because of the additional allocation provided by the Rice Competitiveness Enhancement Fund, the RCEF, which is around 10 to 12 billion if we include also the Crop Diversification Fund from the collections from the tariff. Another new program under that category is the Balik Probinsya, which is being allocated around 500 million, as well as an update of the Registry of Farmers and Agri-Sector at around 220 million. So we're seeing these new projects that are not part of the usual programming that is being set in the DA locally funded projects. The fourth recipient in terms of program type is farm to market roads. That's this around 10 billion budget for farm to market roads, pretty much consistent with what's been allocated in the past 4 years. The big spike here for the dotted blue line is really, as I mentioned earlier, the financing and insurance budget that received a lot of realignment from the Bayanihan 2, around 24 billion. That's why there's a big spike there. How this is going to be implemented and which agency actually ends up implementing it, I think is something that we have yet to see. I think the DBM already released some of these funds as reported in the news to the agencies as part of Bayanihan 2. So there should be a program that's being rolled out for cash assistance or financing to agriculture workers. Other key programs that are bunched up at the low part of the graph are the market development, extension, research and development. And it's quite interesting that some of these key initiatives are actually receiving budgets lower than general administration and support, which is like the general overhead of the Department of Agriculture. Looking at it from a commodity angle, if you slice it based on commodities, so the biggest recipient of the DA programs is rice, and the biggest chunk of that rice investment is really in production support. So seeds, fertilizer, and all that. The next would be agri-equipment and facilities, and part of that is irrigation and also research and development. So We did not include here the NIA budget because that will skew the graph completely because of its 30 billion allocation. But after rice, the biggest recipient is this sort of category we bucketed as unspecified. These are different line items in the DA budget that do not pertain to any particular commodity. So either these are programs that feed across commodities, or these are programs that the DA, in designing the budget, has not yet identified which commodity it will receive. But a big portion of that is in farm to market roads. So most of these farm to market roads would probably cut across all these different commodities. Second to this bucket of unspecified is fisheries, and then high value crops, followed by core and livestock. So this is something that a lot of researchers that follow DA also followed. How much in terms of how much, if we divide in commodities, the budget of the DA goes to, because a lot of observers are saying we probably need to invest more in the other commodities apart from rice, so that we can increase the productivity and also the incomes of our farmers. So this is a historical view. So what I showed you earlier was for 2021. This shows you a historical view of this commodity allocation across the past 5 years. So consistently, rice has been the number one commodity. Sometimes it gets overtaken by this bucket that's unspecified. Mostly these farm to market roads that feed through all these different commodities, but it's rice by a mile. Sometimes high value crops come second, and then fisheries as well. So this is you could say a consistent path that's followed. And interestingly enough, with the passage of the rice tariffication law, with the increased budgets for the Rice Competitiveness Enhancement Fund, the budget for rice as a commodity that we invest in is actually higher, as we can see here in 2020 as well as 2021. Moving to the DENR budget. So the DENR budget here, as we can see in the past 7 years, has really been quite stable at 20 to 30 billion at that level. And the disbursement has also been around at that level, 20 to 25 billion. So this includes the different attached agencies within DENR as well. If we divide, if we categorize segment the DENR budget based on its major programs for the past 5 years, what's noticeable really is that consistently the biggest recipient is forest and watershed. So one of the biggest investments or programs that the DENR is implementing is this reforestation project. There's been a lot of concerns about the implementation of that project. Nevertheless, the level of investment that goes to that has been in a way relentless. This has continued to be an investment priority for the national government. And what would be interesting to ask our panelists is if there has been a sort of impact assessment on how that project has been designed and how it has been implemented. Second to forest and watershed, the second biggest recipient of budgets from the DENR is really natural resource enforcement and regulation. So this is the permitting bureaucracy for all the different kinds of permits that developers would need, whether it's in forest permits, water permits, in these different areas. So if you look at this and the third biggest recipient is general administration, which is the overhead of DENR. So looking at it from where the money is being invested, you can draw the conclusion that DENR is really a reforestation and permitting agency. And that in a way is quite worrisome, because you would think for a country like the Philippines, we would also have a lot of investments in protected areas as well as coastal and marine ecosystems. But those two sectors actually receive much less. They even receive less than the budget of DNR for their support operations. So this is all the regular overhead that an agency incurs. So if you look at it from, if you think about it from an organization management, or if this were a business, the overhead is much higher than the actual investment that goes to the different programs and actual interventions. So this has been going on for our analysis shows the past 5 years, but maybe if we even go further than that, this is probably a trend that will continue to be there. So as we think about the new normal, and as we think about also the challenges that come with climate change, I think a discussion is long overdue about the need maybe not just to restructure the budget, but really the design of our environment programs. Because as we're seeing, it doesn't seem like we're investing in the priorities that we need to invest. So for example, coastal and marine ecosystems, a big part of our GDP is dependent on tourism, and a big part of our tourism is dependent on these areas. So if we neglect to invest in the conservation of these areas, we will see some ripple effect in other sectors. So now that tourism is at its has bottomed out, you could say, because of the very minimal movement during this period. Next year might be a good time to invest in some of these areas, especially by investing in those areas, we can also provide jobs with those who've been displaced by the downturn in the tourism sector. So if we're looking at possible proposals for realignments for next year's budget, maybe there's room for investments that can both create jobs and at the same time help protect and conserve some of our key prized locations. And I think the way the budget is structured also speaks to some of the deficiencies in how GDP is measured. If you're a government planner, you might think, should I invest in coastal and marine ecosystems, or should I invest in roads? Like, if you think about the multipliers in building in infrastructure, the impact on GDP would be higher if you build a road, but the impact to the communities of investing in coastal and marine ecosystems might not be captured by the GDP numbers, but it might actually have greater multipliers if you take a look at it from a different perspective. So stepping back and looking at these two budgets within the whole spread of the national government budget, you can see here that the DA budget of around 63 billion and the DNR budget of around 25 billion added up to around 100 billion really pales in comparison to what the other agencies are receiving. So if you're thinking about, government's investments in trying to create jobs in the blue and green economy of the Philippines, the amount we're putting there is much lower than what we're putting in infrastructure with a DPWH budget, in mass transit systems with a DOTR budget, almost half than what we're putting in the Philippine National Police. It's almost equal to what we're putting in the Philippine Army, just the Philippine Army, not including Philippine Air Force and the Philippine Navy and the General Headquarters. So if you take a look at all of our spending in terms of security, what we're spending in agriculture and environment is probably less than a third of that. And if you take a look at DNR, for example, at 25 billion, it's a little more than what we're investing in this program to end the local communist armed conflict. So looking at where the money is speaks to what exactly are the programs being prioritized, and how the programs are being designed could actually have an impact in some outcomes. So I think this whole fixation in security isn't just rhetorical. We can see it also in how the money is being invested, as well as which bureaucracies are actually being empowered to work with communities. No? So if we reimagine, for instance, instead of investing in this very vague and the local communist armed conflict program, and instead invest that in key environmental conservation projects, a whole universe of possibilities opens up, and maybe that's an area that advocates can take up. So just to wrap up, mindful of what's being invested in agri and environment, I think it's also good to be aware of other considerations that need to be factored in when we try to come up with our proposals for realignment. So one of that, some of those are listed here. So the continued slowdown in the economy, the widening fiscal deficit, of course, increased unemployment, more returning OFWs, lower OFW deployments, the need also to invest in election preparation, both from a from an institutional sense, that COMELEC needs to be equipped in preparing for an election in 2022 that might be an election in the middle still of COVID, and also the reality that the 2021 budget is seen by many of our policymakers who are also up for re-election as an election year budget. And not just talking about the levels, it's also the challenges that the bureaucracy is having in terms of using up the funds. So this isn't isolated. This cuts through all the different bureaucracies, whether it's in social protection, education, job generation, so on and so forth. Another interesting development that will have a big impact both for the national government as well as specifically for agri-environmental sector is the Mandanos ruling that is up for implementation in 2022, which will shift around 260 billion of national government resources to local government. So the question there is 260 billion, that's almost twice what's allocated right now for DA and DENR. So the question is, what programs will the national government leave and depend on the LGUs to implement? Agriculture has been a sector that has, been caught in the middle of this national local dynamic. So this discussion will open up even more when 260 billion is on the table for redistribution. So advocates in the agricultural space should be mindful of that as well. So that's it, Aika. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Luis. So we will be joined by our panelists, Dr. Roehlano Briones, Dr. Ben Malayang, and Ms. Marita Rodriguez. Hello po. Okay. So I'll introduce muna. Dr. Briones is a senior research fellow at PIGS, where he conducts policy research for the Philippine government with a specialization in agriculture. He has authored numerous published research papers and co-edited 4 books about the economics of agriculture and natural resources, rural development, food security, international trade, and the macroeconomy. He is a board member of the consultancy group Brain Trust Incorporated, a former board member of the Philippine Economic Society, as well as a fellow of the Foundation for Economic Freedom. Hello, Dr. Roel.
Hi, good afternoon.
Next is Dr. Ben Malayang III. He is currently a professor emeritus at the Institute of Environmental and Marine Sciences at the Saliman University and served as the university's president from 2006 to 2018. He also serves as the chair of Participatory Research Organization of Communities Towards Struggle for Self-Reliance or Process, and the vice chair of the Foundation for Philippine environment. Dr. Malayang is a former Undersecretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and has been an inspiration for public service among his colleagues working for environmental protection and management of the country's natural patrimony. Hello, Dr. Ben. You're on mute, sir.
Thank you, Aika. Thank you.
Hello po.
Thank you.
And then lastly, we have Ms. Marita Rodriguez.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello po. She is currently the Executive Director of NGOs for Fisheries Reform. She has more than 20 years of experience in working with the fisherfolk communities. With a background in political science, she has written studies on food sovereignty and poverty eradication, vulnerability assessments, climate change and gender in the coastal communities. Hello, Ms. Mayet.
Good afternoon.
Okay. So, thank you kay Luis no kanina for a very insightful presentation on the agricultural and environmental sectors budgets. So, I'll ask Ms. Mayet muna, what about your assessment of the proposed 2021 budget, I guess particularly on the environmental sector?
Sige, good afternoon. Because my exposure is on coastal and fisherfolk communities, so let me focus on that aspect in the agriculture as well as in the environment. So, I think the problem we are facing now in terms of fisheries is overfishing and degraded fish habitat. So overfishing, that will be in the realm of the Department of Agriculture, and then the degraded fish habitat would be in the realm of the DENR. This leads to low income of fisherfolk communities. So we need livelihood support for the fisherfolk communities. From what I heard so far, I think we need investments to help the fisherfolk increase their income and have resilient livelihoods. But unfortunately, we see that there is little investments in the fisheries. Very notable also for me is the very low investments in coastal and in coastal protection. Uh, I I think the increased investment in forestry is okay from the lens of coastal resource, because we have the mangrove forest, which is also within the jurisdiction of the DENR. Luis earlier asked about what we think of the impact of that big investment in forestry. Well, I think if I'm not mistaken, that refers to the National Greening Program of the government through the DENR, ano? And we have also engaged in mangrove reforestation under the NGP. But there is this saying that forests are not just number of trees. So it's not it doesn't help much in rehabilitation of the mangrove forest, because there is problem with how the NGP is, or the National Greening Program is being implemented. It's more of looking at the number of trees planted rather than how the mangrove area has been protected. So I was hoping, and also with the pandemic, I was hoping to see increased investment in, well, I saw that there is a big investment in infrastructure. Our partner communities during the pandemic have had problem with uh, marketing their fish catch. So I hope there is those infra budgets would include farm to, not just farm to market roads, but also roads from coastal communities to the markets. And also, hopefully, there will be investments in shortening the supply chain so that the produce of the fisher folk communities and well as the agri sector would reach the market the shorter possible time so that income of the farmers and the fisher folk would improve. Maybe that's all for now for me.
Thank you, Ms. Mayet. Next, I'll ask Dr. Roel to comment on Luis's presentation.
Hi, thanks, Aika, and thanks for the invitation to this Rappler webinar. So I listened. It's very good presentation by Luis, putting together a lot of the data. I've been looking at bits and pieces, but it's very much worthwhile to look at it from a more holistic perspective and see, and even in relationship to the environment and its sister agency, the DNR. That said, there's a lot of facts presented, but I found it a little bit short of explicitly stating its assessment of what the configuration of the 2021 budget is in relation to agriculture and the environment. So let me try to supplant or supply some of that claim, okay? There seems to be a hint that there is underinvestment in agriculture, especially when there was a comparison made with the humongous budgets of the DPWH, the PNP, the National Defense, and so on. So that seems to be one. Within agriculture, there seems to be in itself also an overinvestment in one single commodity of rice. And that's simply just in the form of production support, let alone if we add the unadded portion, as Luis himself mentioned, of agriculture that will really blow the bias towards rice in the expenditure program of the government through the roof. So let me handle these two supplied conclusions in turn. Yeah, I think one can make the case about underinvestment in agriculture, although the certain cautions need to be mentioned. If we look at the economic cluster's pushback against the budget proposal of DA and its subsequent cut, as Luis has already mentioned, some of the reasons cited was the fact that actually agriculture expenditures being done in an economy which has already undergone considerable, what we call, economists call, structural transformation. As Luis himself pointed out, there's now less than 10% of the output being produced with GDP. So just by sheer reallocation, maybe if you see a budget more than 10% going to agriculture, you have to wonder, well, what's the justification for that, right? I'm not saying that that should not be the case, but there should be a good reason why we would, let's say it's for a proper expenditure and so on and so forth. That's also my beef with laws like Agri-Agra. Right? It was done long time ago, and it nailed the loan allocation to about 20% of GDP for agriculture. And now it's already kind of obsolete because, as mentioned, less than 10% of economic output is being produced in agriculture. So it's just simply showing that there's a huge allocation to other sectors relative to agriculture doesn't make the case that there's already overinvestment in agriculture. In particular, especially if you look at the way the budget is already being utilized. And this is already in a previous slide of Dr. Abad. No? So he pointed out that actually the disbursements is consistently below and sometimes way below the appropriation. And the strange thing is when the appropriation goes down, the disbursement also goes down. So you would have thought that it's because masyado mong nilamunan ng maraming funds, hindi niya malunok. Pero nung niliitan mo, lumiit din yung nalulunok niya. So what's going on here? So I think there's a very valid reason to check first the absorptive capacity institutionally of the bureaucracies. We're not singling out DA. We're also looking at the attached agencies, the other agencies to see what is really their capacity to absorb the funds that are being appropriated by the people through the Congress to them. Before we advocate aggressively raising expenditure, and it turns out that implementation-wise, hindi rin pala magmamaterialize in terms of added resources in reality for additional spending for the sector. The point of overinvestment in rice, I fully subscribe and agree. And I think that that's a good argument, not for raising the expenditure in agriculture, but for reallocating the existing budget in agriculture more for the other relatively neglected sectors. Yes, rice farming is the biggest source of livelihood by far in agriculture, but there's still a lot of significant chunks of agriculture out there that are being relatively neglected. The coconut farmers, the corn farmers, the assorted fruit and vegetable farmers, the fisher folk. Yeah, so all of these also actually account for probably a bigger chunk of the marginalized sector in agriculture, especially in the uplands. No, so relatively speaking, sad to say, DA has not focused so much attention. Yes, it has certain programs like Saad and so on, but it's not really the main focus, not like a banner program, quote unquote, as is allocated for rice. Now, before I end this, I have a last comment. The last point that he mentioned about mandanas, it's not just mandanas, you know, this is an overwhelming reality in agricultural sector spending, that actually the frontline unit for delivery of these support services and so on is actually the local government. So these DAOSEC budgets that we saw, these commodity programs that we saw, they're not directly being delivered by the DA to farmers. They're all coursed. Every single centavo is coursed through local governments in terms of frontline service delivery. So it's not the DA person that the the farmer actually sees. It's actually the LGU extension worker who directly or indirectly reports to the mayor of that locality. Now, if that particular mayor doesn't place much importance in agriculture, then that's a problem for that entire locality. Hindi ko naman nilalahat, no? So it's not just a reality for the mandanas, it's also a reality for even for today. That said, the mandanas could represent an even bigger shot in the arm for decentralized allocation of the budget. And there are many discussions on how that's going to be funded. One approach that is getting, I think, more popular now, getting more influence now, is defunding some of the national projects and letting the local government take over that. For instance, the farm to market roads, that 10-12 billion chunk annually that we see being delivered, downloaded through the DA, could actually be defunded at the national level and then used to fund the mandanas, and then it will be the job of the local governments to actually implement those farm to market roads. So that's a startling implication. Whether that will result in a net improvement or not is something that can be debated. What should be in place, though, is in terms of more aggressive decentralization as represented by the mandanas, is we should have also more aggressive monitoring and evaluation of what's going on, right? If we're gonna defund those national projects and then ask the local governments to take care of them, how do we know they're really taking care of them? The DILG has no, I'm not exaggerating, has no mechanism right now to be able to properly track, not the DILG, not the DOF. So correct me if I'm wrong, if there's somebody in the audience with greater knowledge about this, but really we're helpless at the national level to really figure out as a whole how the local governments are actually allocating their various development budgets. I think I can end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Roel. Next po, we will go back to some of your points later after Dr. Ben.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I have here some notes. I have several points, 3 points to make. I clustered my comments in three general points and some specifics based on the remarks of Luis. First, regarding the budget and the growth levers, I'm more broad here because I look at the numbers in a broader terms. Number one, we may need to examine how these budgets, DA and DNR, contribute to the building up of this and strengthening of these five levers. That needs to be, I think, looked at in light of the fact that we are on a COVID situation. Second, what would be the budget translations of basic and green infrastructure here, other than potentially the so-called unspecified and infrastructure that I have a suspicion are really pork barrel allocations. And so we need to be careful with that. Number three, should a digital future be only for companies, as is indicated in the five growth levers? Why not also for government, as Dr. William Torres suggests? How much of these budgets are for building up digital ecosystems of food production, biodiversity conservation, and strengthening agrarian communities in relation to DAR? And when in the levers, we talk of rescaling and redeployment at scales. Could this focus on building high-value industries? Now, should these industries be limited to only land-based foods? Is there a thinking behind these budgets to shift the locus of our sources of food, fiber, feeds, or their components from our vaster blue biodiversity, which, if managed right, seems to have higher low-input biomass accumulation and sustainability potentials than the foods produced from land? My second point is about the ecological logic of the budgets. It appears that most of DA's budget would be for land-based agriculture. BFAR's, the budget for BFAR, is pronouncedly minuscule compared to the budgets for rice and other cereals and land-based protein production. And by the way, is the budget for rice all sourced from the RCEF, or does it still dip into the other revenues of the government? Now, my next point here is, why is our focus in agriculture on land-based production when our country has a very limited land surface of only about 30 million hectares? My question is, how rational is this overall when, being land domiciling beings, our rapidly growing population would be eventually sequestering more of our limited land areas for their homes, facilities, and infrastructure? As our population grows, and we need to expand areas for roads, hospitals, schools, and airports, how is this to go on when we'll also need to have more land for agriculture as presently contemplated in these budgets? And also, we need more forests as contemplated in the DENR budget. And if we are talking of land-based forest and land-based agriculture, how are they going to be compatible with our land-starved population? And by the way, have there been efforts to coordinate the areas for expending the budgets of DA and DENR so that they achieve the most optimum mutual support for each other's mandates? Apparently, DENR is reforesting where it can reforest, and DA is providing agriculture, investing on agriculture where it can, and then looking for ways of how to put the water into the agriculture through high expenditures on irrigation, because the forests are being established somewhere else. To the extent that the budgets of DA is towards expanding land-based food production, and the DNRs is toward expanding land-based biodiversity enclaves, how might this be deemed rational and logical in the face of our expanding land-consuming population? To the DA, I ask this question: how many hectares would be needed to maintain a level of domestic land-based agricultural production so that will be food secure? And how many hectares would need to be added for every, say, million addition to our population? How would this too be sustainable in the future? To the DNR, how many hectares of forest and protected areas we would need in order to maintain functional watersheds, sufficient levels of environmental security, and ecological stability? And how many hectares do we need to add for every, say, 1 million addition to our population? How would this too be sustainable in the long run? Has someone done the math on how these needed lands for agriculture and forests add up and compared to the total the lands that now are being occupied for human habitation and accessory infrastructure? I believe that at this time we are around, of our 30 million hectares, around 24 to 25 million are already built up. And out of that, we have 10 million hectares for agriculture and irrigation. So hindi ko malaman kung ano yung suma total nung kinakailangan ng agrikultura, kinakailangan ng ating mga gubat, at saka kinakailangan ng ating mga subdivision. So yun lang ang logic na pinipresenta ko dito. So my point number 3. Do these budgets represent an intent to secure our future or to push us to a future of continuing land use insecurity? Do these budgets suggest a sustainable future or a future of Malthusian conflicts? Why not reflect in these budgets a higher national commitment on spurring development investment toward a robust and resilient blue economy for our archipelagic country that has 7 times more water than land? Would we not have a wider space for future-proofing our food, environmental, and human security in a blue economy than in an economy placed, anchored on a much smaller basket of land? And so these are my 3 major points that I can put on the table. But let me just comment on the concept of security and defense. The budget for the military is much higher than those for agriculture and DENR. Why? Because the concept of our defense is a concept of defense against aggression and insurgency. But we do not seem to understand that there is less loss of life and property from aggression and insurgency than from flooding and other environmental disasters in our land. If you look at the statistics, and I don't have it now here, but I did, there are more people who died as a result of environmental insecurity. More properties have been lost every year as a result of environmental insecurity than from foreign aggression, for sure, and from insurgency. And yet, our budget are more for the latter rather than for the former. So ito yung mga sinasabi ko, ano ba talaga ang logic nito lahat ng framework ng ating budgeting? Is it a budgeting based on reality or budgeting based on political allocations? And number 2, resilience. Resilience. To what extent do this actually, given my 3 points, to what extent do these budgets add up to improving the resilience of our country? I happen to think that it was not COVID that really upended us. What upended us was our inability to prepare properly for what already was obvious rising tide of climate change-related insecurities. Nasa national framework, national plan, action plan for climate change, 2011 to 2028. There's a section there on health, buffering our resilience to health-related risks from climate change. None of them were, I think, budgeted. So ito po ang masasabi ko lang ngayon na we really need to rethink the thinking behind our budget. Salamat po.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. So I guess my next question for everyone po, no? What should be prioritized in terms of reallocation sa budget? We saw nga po, no, kanina you also pointed out, din ni Luis na we saw in terms of commodity, rice got the most, but Dr. Roel said there should be others like coconut, corn, corn, fruits and vegetables, fisheries, of course. And
My
sa
answer to that,
and sa DENR naman po, nakita natin forestation. Sure po, sure, sir.
yeah, my answer to that is really fundamentally shift to more investments on the blue economy. So, for example, instead of agriculture, food security based on land-based agriculture, why don't we not start shifting our budgetary allocations towards the improving the agricultural quote-unquote productivity or protein productivity coming from the oceans? So that's number one. And then for reforestation, we probably need to do more reforestation of our coastal areas if our thinking is more of our food security should come from our coastal regions rather from our limited agricultural regions. Now, I was referring to coastal areas and aquatic biodiversity. Their ability to increase their biomass naturally with only sunlight is much higher than our ability to acquire biomass increases in land. You need to till the land, you need to put more inputs in the land, you need to have irrigation. All these are high investment biomass accumulation. But sa dagat, anuhin mo yan eh, you just maintain the ecological balance of the sea. It can produce more accumulation of biomass, just left alone. So that yun. So mangroves should be given more emphasis than hillside forest, unless you are able to protect hillside forest from subdivisions. But how can you protect this hillside forest from subdivision when you are not protecting ourselves from high increases in population? So for every additional 100 people that we need to have, should we have another bed in the hospital for that, or so many beds in the hospital? So human demand for land inevitably will be increasing because of our population growth. So ito yun lahat. So ang sinasabi ko, Aika, would be to start thinking strategically rather than opportunistically. And by the way, I think one realignment should be to remove those unspecified. Okay? And really go for biodiversity or biomass increases. Invest on biomass increases rather than infrastructure.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. I think si Ms. Mayet po gusto mag-add. Okay, let's go po muna with sige.
I didn't notice I'm on mute. I would like to follow up on what Doc Ben has just said. Actually, when you were posting your question, I was also preparing my answer on coastal resource management, marine protected areas, blue economy. Yes, I strongly agree on that. Because in improving the oceans and the coastal ecosystems would help not only help increase resilience but also improve the livelihoods and also helps increase food security. For reforestation, yes, there should be reforestation, but more on the coastal areas and to improve the aquatic biodiversity. Why? Because there are studies, particularly by Dr. Georgian Primavera, that mangrove ecosystems help improve the adaptive capacity of the coastal community. So we should protect our mangroves. And aside from that, mangroves also are natural fish habitat. So that would help improve the fish stocks in coastal communities. So maraming maitutulong kung mag-allocate tayo ng investment sa coastal areas. I may be biased because I'm with the NGOs for Fisheries Reform, but I think others would also agree that investments in coastal communities and fisheries would help really improve our conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mayet. Dr. Roel?
Well, since we're talking about a lot about blue economy, let me just sugunduhan ko lang yung sinabi ni Ben about uh, the importance to emphasize the blue economy. Let me just link it to what he also pointed out is the expansion of built-up areas. This is inevitable. We can avoid it to some extent by building vertically, but there's still that wide expanse, not just for residential areas, but even for industrial areas, as we are envisioning more industrial development towards the future. But one place we know for sure we shouldn't be building up is along the coasts because of climate change. It's foolish to continue the trend of expanding along the coastal areas, the built-up areas. LGU should be discouraged from doing this. Big cities should be discouraged from doing this. If they want to enjoy waterways, maybe they can explore lakes and rivers, but definitely not the coasts, because those coasts in the next 4 or 5 decades are going to swallow up large chunks for sure of those built-up areas. So rather than built-up areas, natural habitats, I think, should be the preserve of more and more of the coastal zone in a reality, in an era of climate change. And of course, yeah. So if we can also at the same time rejuvenate the productivity, even for human needs, no, by more fish, other seaweed and other productive biodiversity that we can get from the coastal areas. Yeah, this is really something that we should be exploring more. And again, this might turn out to be, maybe we should now look at the developmental functions of an agency like a DNR. Although that's another whole new discussion, no? I happen to believe that if you have a development agency for the environment, it cannot be a regulatory agency. There should be 2 different agencies in charge of regulating the environment and developing coastal livelihoods, coastal and forest-based livelihoods. But yeah, something like maybe we should start looking at the reallocation of our budget from a bigger perspective, not just rice versus corn or fish, but this bigger agro ecosystem type of assessment.
Thank you, Dr. Roel. So I guess my question po next, I'll zoom into agriculture. There are a lot of comments on Facebook live po natin, no? And they are asking particularly on FMRs. So we saw it's largely flat, the FMR allocation from the past few years and for the next year. And they're asking, ano po raw ba talaga ang long-term impact ng FMRs? Especially that there are a lot of leakages din sa FMR. So I guess sino po kayong Dr. Roel or Dr.
Yeah,
Ben?
I can take a first crack of that, no? FMR is the branding. May taga-DA ba dito? Is the branding that the agricultural department managed to stamp on what are actually barangay roads. These are actually by other DPWH classification, barangay roads. But then they said, oh, no, it's actually to link farms to markets. That's probably the least valuable, frankly speaking, that's probably the least valuable function. What are you actually linking? You're linking communities. That barangay road or farm to market road might eventually open up access to the school, to the health clinic, to the communities, to the populations. But then, of course, you try to justify it in terms of farm to market para makadaan siya sa DA. Is kind of a tail wagging the dog issue. That said, so that's why if you do a mandanas thing and say that fund gets reallocated to local governments, theoretically, it might open up a greater avenue for looking at the wider benefits, the population level or welfare benefits of these barangay roads, and help more rationally allocate the placement of the budgets and of the actual roads. That said, there's also the counterpart fear, no? This also already been pointed out. Usually, pag tinitingnan yung budget ng FMR, titingnan ni Congressman X, ganong kalaki niyan nasa distrito ko. Ano-anong mga lugar ilalagay yan. So, through that way, it becomes a kind of a disguised pork barrel. And if this goes to the LGUs all the more, no? Because these are really going to be subject to the depredations of local politicians who will attempt to manipulate the budget so that they can best, maximize their chance for re-election. That said, still, if we believe in representative democracy, there should be a natural check and balance of an informed electorate, so that we will more and more become mature and not really be swayed by politicized allocation of these interest groups, but more of what is really beneficial to the greater masses of people, farmers or rural folk or fisher folk, and so on. So that's just my little bit of reflection on farm to market road. But let me reiterate the need for a better understanding of what areas are actually being linked by these roads, what land uses are being affected by the placement of these roads. We're just at the infancy of mapping out these roads in relation to our national database of land use. And the more we can push in that regard in an era of big data, I think the better for more rationalized allocation.
Thank you, sir. I think Dr. Ben wants to add.
Ito mga farm-to-market roads, precisely isang punto ko would be, paano ba nadidetermine ng rota nitong mga farm-to-market roads? Is it based on ecological considerations? Because on the one hand, the more roads you have accessing towards the forests, roads usually promote more deforestation at saka, cutting of trees. So, pag-isa yan. Pangalawa, the more roads you open, the lesser number of hectares available for food production. So again, ito yung mga pag-iisip na kailangan i-reconcile. Pwede naman, kailangan naman siguro natin roads kasi talagang, as I was saying earlier, the more population you have, you would have to need to have this infrastructure. Pero ngayon, itong sabihin mo, to mitigate the fact that, mitigate the negative impact of roads on agricultural production and on protection of forests, maybe this should be placed and routed through places where they would pose the least danger to or risks to our forest as well as to our farmlands. Yun ang gusto ko lang ma-emphasize dito. Kaysa dyan na, kasi kailangan i-spend yung money for roads. So roads in themselves are good for humans, but are they good for forest and are they good for agriculture? Yun ang kailangan natin pag-isipan. Wala naman akong sinasabi na it has to be one way or the other. Gusto ko lang sabihin na kailangan siguro a deeper creative and good faith conversation on these matters.
Di ba, Ben, a lot of these mountain roads were actually built to give access to TLAs, timber licensing agreements.
That was it. And there has been some correlation. The more you open up an area to roads, the more illegal cuttings will happen. So pag-isipan lang. Sinasabi ko na.
Magsimula yung all-weather road, tapos kiklean up yung TLA, pero may mga tao na doon, so magkakaroon na ng barangay, then sisementohin, ayun na yun. So it's exactly. The forest is gone.
Exactly. And yet we want to spend more money to plant more forests. Where's the logic there? Where's the rationality of that? So kailangan siguro ang rationality natin sa ating budgeting should be based on what Dr. Roel was saying, a more strategic agri-ecosystemic view of our national food as well as environmental security. Not just saan yung opportunities for this year. So yun ang sasabihin ko dyan.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ben. Ms. Mayet, do you want to add po ba?
Yeah, I agree with what Dr. Well has pointed out about mapping of the farm-to-market roads. As a private sector, I'm a member of the Philippine Council for Agriculture and Fisheries. And I got a chance to be involved in monitoring of DA-funded projects in rural communities. And we have monitored implementation of farm-to-market roads. There are roads, siguro talagang good criteria would be linking of communities to the markets talaga. So dapat when we map out kung saan ilalagay ang mga farm-to-market roads, we should have that in mind. I personally saw some good projects, good FMR projects that really helped the communities, and they testify that it has helped them reach the market better, ganyan. But I also saw some roads na we are wondering, anong rational nito? Saan to pupunta? Bakit may kalsada dito? Yung mga tipong ganon. Sa gitna ng bukid, merong concrete road na putol naman, di ba, yung ganon. So, if we are in itself, I think FMRs are good investment, pero yun tama. We should plan it well, make sure that it really links the communities to the market. Kaya nga farm to market roads. Yun lang po, thank you.
Thank you po. Next is, you mentioned, nakita natin sa presentation kay Luis, no, mataas yung investments to rice, other commodities pale in comparison to rice. But also there's another sentiment na if we're going to say restructure the DA budget and give allocations to other commodities, if it will not be if the congressmen won't add additional budget to the DA, di ang ano niyan baka mabawasan yung investments on rice. So I guess how would you respond to those who or those who might react na if we lower investments on rice, then are we forgetting our rice farmers?
So remember, it's the farmer, and the farmer is not nailed to a single commodity. So some of these farmers, even in a more competitive basis, will still be planting rice. Some other farmers might be alternating rice. In the flooded season, plant rice. In the dry season, plant some other crop. Others might leave rice altogether and actually make more money planting some other crop or even doing some aquaculture. So, it's too limiting if we just say, rice farmer forever. Let's make sure that he has enough money so he can keep farming rice forever. I think this is really short-sighted, and this is the essential dynamism of a free market economy. So the thing is to facilitate movement where some adjustment is warranted, especially since possibly this particular area is not really that productive for rice. Medyo pataas na ng bundok, mahirap i-access ng irrigation. Maybe some other crop or some other land use might be better for that. And we need an agricultural development program which is attuned to those possibilities.
Thank you. Meron pa po ba? I will move on to another question. Okay. So, sir, you mentioned nga po na farmer and pwede silang magtanim ng iba, no? Depende rin sa season, depende kung saan sila nakatira or saan yung lupa nila. So I guess yung next question ko po, no, during the lockdown, nag-grow yung agricultural sector by 0.5% na contribution to the GDP, no? The World Bank is saying that we should have more investments in agriculture because it is key to recovery. There are also um, economists from the Ateneo de Manila University na nagsasabi na it will provide more jobs among the poor if we increase at least 100, if we increase the budget of the Department of Agriculture. So I guess yung question ko in terms of the agricultural impact, is there a ballpark figure of a budget that would give considerable increase in the contribution to the GDP in terms of the budget po?
I have a take on that first. My take is, first of all, we need to have a very robust natural resource accounting system to really clearly determine the comparative value of primary productivity, such as vegetables, rice, etc., and fisheries, and ecosystems that support these fisheries, so that we have a better idea of why we must invest in these areas. For example, sa agriculture, I think ang tinitingnan lang, correct me Roel kasi sa iyo talaga to, ang tinitingnan lang siguro na value ng agrikultura is yung na kukuha natin, na harvest natin sa ating mga kalupaan. Hindi natin sinasama ang value doon ng watersheds that will need to provide the water for those crops, or as pest breaks and wind breaks for our agricultural production. So, hindi nasama yon sa valuation natin. In fact, sa fisheries, I think the reason why the investment budget allocation for fisheries is low is because naturally the logic of the GDP is that fisheries is providing only 3% or 1.3% of the GDP. Mababa. So bakit ka mag-invest doon? Mababa naman. Pero mababa yan dahil hindi maganda ang pagka-evaluate noong fisheries. The fact is almost 80-85% of our population depend for around 60 to 65% of the population depend for about 80 to 85% of their protein from fisheries. And then don't tell me it has only a GDP value of that much. Siyempre, marami sa ating fisheries kinakain natin na hindi nare-report doon sa NEDA. So hindi mabavalue yan. So the valuation system. So I really welcome the fact that there's an effort in Congress now led by Deputy Speaker Loren de Garda to develop a Philippine Environmental and Natural Resource Accounting law system for this. So that's one. Kailangan natin klaruhin yung valuation system natin sa ating that's behind the budgeting. The second one is depende kasi kung hindi kasi yan I think a question of how much. The question is where that how much is going to be made. If you are going to pour money on forests that are likely to be eliminated in 5 years' time by subdivisions, okay? Even if it is so much that goes down the drain. But if you are going to put even 1/2 of what you are putting on forests now, on say mangroves, that will produce more fisheries for us into the future, into the longer future. Again, if properly valued and sustained, we might probably have that, peso, value per peso would probably be better in those places. So I think the question really is still the rationality of the budget assumptions.
Thank you, Dr. Ben.
Yeah, Ben, remember in the 90s, uso yung NRAP, the Environment and Natural Resources Accounts.
Tama yun. That was actually tried, but medyo the way I understood it, kasi I was then with the DENR, it did not make marked difference between the values and national income accounts. Parang ganun. But it was more a method that needed to be sharpened. Right now, itong ginagawa nila sa Kongreso, I think there's a lot of discussion over it, and I think you're familiar with these discussions, sila Marian. And I think kailangan lang natin talaga tingnan yon. Kasi the absence of any complete or practical valuation of our natural resources, and especially, Roel, the ecosystem services that go to food production. Okay? The ecosystem services that go to food production to support farms. We need to really need to put the correct value on those so that they will go into properly being reflected by the national budget. At the end of the day, the national budget is the national policy on what are the priorities of the country.
And actually, we should do that across the board. No? If we have a real price of carbon, that will really depreciate the value of coal plant investment if you really account for the total cost of that activity. But back to your question, Aika, no? I think the World Bank paper, I think I was a chapter contributor there, actually talked about investment in agribusiness development. So it was a bit broader than that. So that does not equate to putting in more money to the Department of Agriculture. In the first place, it's not just government investment or government money that we're talking about. We're talking about entire, we should actually mobilize even greater private sector resources. We've always been saying banks have been underinvesting, businesses have been underinvesting in agriculture. Bakit kaya? And if there are certain policy-related bottlenecks that can fix that, maybe those are the things that we could address. Maybe it doesn't require hundreds of billions of budget if it's just some regulatory or policy-related bottleneck. It might just be, stroke of a pen or improved infrastructure of permitting, etc. In our national national or even local bureaucracy. So I hesitate to give an actual number in terms of how much money we should put in Department of Agriculture. I think really the first thing we have to look at is to look at the absorptive capacity of that agency. Once we can confidently see that there have been dramatic reforms in that direction, then we can open up the discussion about, maybe we can look at adding some budget, since in fact we can see it being translated to real life projects on the ground, really affecting the lives of people. Rather than yung nabanggit ni Mayet na roads going to nowhere, literally nowhere. That's the last thing we want to spend. 12 million pesos per kilometer. Ganan niya yung costing, 12 to 15 million pesos per kilometer. Kilometer lang yan of FMR. If you need 100 kilometers of those, kwentahin na natin, di ba? Kung ilang billion yon.
Thank you, Dr. Roel. Ms. Mayet?
Sige. I'm also for the valuation of the natural resources, of the existing resources, so that when we look at investments, we see that these investments also yields some benefits, as what Dr. Roel and Doc Ben has pointed out. And also, I also agree with especially what Dr. Roel has mentioned about absorptive capacities of our government agencies. I noticed in Louis' presentation, about the appropriation allocation versus disbursements. I was also wondering, bakit when the budget has been decreased, yung disbursements nagdi-decrease din. But when you look at the communities, they desperately need investments to help them improve their livelihoods. Ayun. So about agri-business investments, I think we should also look at investments in communities talaga, in cooperatives, help them build their capacities on enterprises, because the last slide of Luis talked about global and domestic recession. I think one way to address recession is make the economy more dynamic, and making the economy dynamic is making people have money to spend. So parang building local economy. So let's look at investments that really will help the people get connected to the market, have capital to earn income, and the resource base be improved so that it yields more resources for them to earn income. Yun po, thank you.
Thank you,
Aika,
Ms. Mayer.
may
Sige,
I add,
sure
Aika,
po.
sa sandali. Bakit ba na yung budget ng gobyerno tinitingnan on one agencies, tinitingnan on how they compare from one year to another? Medyo historical yung tinitingnan natin. But rather, hindi natin tinitingnan na as indicated by disbursement capabilities or absorptive capacity, pati tinitingnan yung efficiency, the relative efficiency of the budget in terms of how much of the budget turns to services, actual services. And then use that as basis for budgeting in the following year, efficiency. So, ibig kong sabihin na baka naman, kailangan din natin titingnan yung option for a programmatic budget rather than merely a historical budget. Kasi nag-iiba yung situation ng tao. Situation ng from year to another, nagpa-prioritize, nag-iiba yung priority. Next year, we would already have already the rice tariffication, already reached so many months after. So dapat iba na yung sitwasyon sa rice farming. Dapat. So but nare-reflect ba yan sa budget? Parang hindi kasi go on as usual, ito ang budget ng NFA dati, ayusin pa natin, we will maintain it. So historical as against programmatic, I think pag-isipan din yan because this is my other point. A lot of the mandates of the fund of these agencies are inappropriately, if not insufficiently, or even not funded at all. Ito yung mga unfunded mandates. Because nagsishift yung mga political priorities over the years, but the budgets continue to be there, hindi nagagamit. So again, that might explain why, on the one hand, lalo ang disbursement, kasi hindi na relevant, hindi magagamit, wala sa programa, and then mga other mandates sa mga ahensya hindi na pupunduhan kasi sinishift nila actually internally to others na doon ang punto. Would you imagine that? Unspecified? Second only to rice? How could any rational person think that you can budget for unspecified? A percent of miscellaneous mo is virtually the second item of the budget, assuming that unspecified is miscellaneous expenditures. That's my point at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. We will now move on to the Q&A questions. We will take questions from the audience. There are some on the Zoom chat, and there are some from the Facebook and other live stream feeds of Rappler. So before that, I'll welcome back Luis to join us for the Q&A. Hello, Luis. Yeah. Okay. So for first question, anyone can answer. This is from Facebook user Pong Fernandez. Most agriculture and aquaculture products are easily spoiled. Hope the government may consider as well to establish environmentally controlled structures, storage, transport, marketplace to all towns all over the country and strategically located in highly populated urban areas. So siguro I guess yung question ko dito talaga is, do you think the investments on linking communities and the market is sufficient given na sa MFR mas malaki? are there other items that should be prioritized?
To me, that's part of the rationalization of the food supply chain of the country, trying to make them more efficient and minimize the value adding that goes along the supply chain. So sometimes we extend the supply chain in order to accommodate more value chain into the supply chain. But we need to probably shorten that so that there's more efficiencies in the direct buyer seller fishers, for example, or farmers directly to their buyers rather than through a lot of intermediary. So that's part of this whole notion. So that in one project that I'm participating in at this time, the USAID Fish Right Project with BIFAR, isa yun sa mga tinitingnan, yung supply chain from fisher directly to their consumers, from the fish catcher to the fish eater as much as possible. And then yung loss yon, yung tinatawag na post-catch waste and losses are being attended to because there's need to do infrastructure on that. Correct yung nagtanong niyan. Critical sa efficient supply chain ang appropriate infrastructure for harvest or post-catch waste and losses. Kailangan yun. Totoo yan. But nasaan yung mga infrastructure investment ng DA? Nandun sa ports, nandun sa kung saan-saan, which is more favorable to the local politicians, hindi to the local fishers or the local farmers. So yun. How much pa of the DA has been spent on providing trucks for fish farmer associations and organizations or fishers association so that matatrack agad nila yung kanilang produce to the market? Meron ba? Wala. I don't think there's any investment from the DA on buying buying for fishers associations. They have to go through the congressman, they have to go through the mayor. So yun ang ano doon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. Ismael?
Yeah. The BFAR, they have this program called Community Fish Landing Centers. The concept is good because that center would serve as parang area for where the fishers can bring their produce, and buyers would be there to buy the produce. I hope there would be more investments on that. There already have been I can't remember the numbers, but a lot has already been constructed, but only a small percentage is already operational. And for us, for NFR, what we want to see with these community fish landing centers are eventually to be managed by the fisher folk organizations. These are initially turned over to the local government units, but conceptually, it's supposed to be eventually managed by the fisher folk communities. The pandemic, in the pandemic, there were experiences where the fisher folks had to lower the prices of their fish catch because exactly dahil nga sa sinabi na they are easily spoiled, and since they cannot transport their produce to the markets, kailangan nilang mabenta agad, so they sell it at lower price. But if we have these community fish landing centers with good facilities, with freezers if needed, and if the buyers can have access to these community fish landing centers, I think it will improve or shorten the time from the produce are harvested to until it reaches the consumers eventually. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mayan. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. This is from, hold on. This is from Dazel Labapis via the Zoom Q&A. There is a noticeably low absorption capacity or implementing capacity of agencies. How do we accelerate the spending for blue and green investments in light of the COVID-19 situation and other future pandemic, hopefully not, and slow onset of disasters? I guess, Dr. Roel, how do we accelerate spending for blue and green investments given the COVID situation and future disasters?
I'm very uncomfortable with the presumption or the presuppositions of the question. It's like it's kind of supply or input driven. What are really the needs of the sector? So and then once we understand what are really the needs of the sector, what elements of especially of a public good nature or that belongs to the function of government can be probably funded out of taxpayer money that could address those underlying needs. So we should actually start from there. So I hesitate to answer the question from that angle. Kasi we'll just be driven by, oh, we need to increase our budget every 10% every year, etc., etc. We're just driven by the supply. We're actually being driven by politicians who want to show that, I'm giving more budget to farmers. Vote for me. Rather than, really trying to address real world problems, solving those problems in the light of a very big picture of numerous problems we cannot actually solve all at the same time. And we actually have to do that delicate balancing act as much as possible based on rationality and the needs of the many rather than the needs of the politicians. I know this is kind of generic, no? But I don't think I can put a number or I can give you a method of increasing investment until we know what the needs of the sector really are and how much taxpayer funded projects could really help in addressing those needs.
Thank you, Dr. Roel. I'll move on to the next question po, no? This is about R&D. This is from Albert Karaan. If we are to fundamentally shift our production practices in agriculture towards a more sustainable and resilient systems, what are your thoughts on the very bleak funding on R&D from these agencies?
The big problem of, first of all, I think we could settle the question. There's a huge, especially for basic research, a huge gap if we just rely on purely commercial motivation. Research is definitely, I'm in the field of policy research. Definitely, there'll be very little commercially funded policy research, and that would be very suspect, no? If it were all funded by, Coca-Cola or Toyota or San Miguel. That said, so there's a big argument for big public investment in agriculture. Again, it's this kind of myopic 3-year term mentality that it's almost impossible to do long-term technology development and R&D, and especially basic research na actually maaring a lot of the sectors even outside the Philippines might actually benefit. So, for instance, I've always lamented the absence of high quality commercial crops, tree crops breeding program. Thailand has such a program, the envy of the world, and we are actually importing a lot of the products of their breeding programs. The guapols, the lanzones, the rambutans. We are producing these fruits, but actually we're importing a large number of these because of the very excellent varieties that they've developed in Thailand at very competitive price, that even if they ship it across the West Philippine Sea, it's still competitive with our prices. But when did they start investing in these breeding programs? Way back in the 60s and 70s. they were saying that it's these scientists that got educated in UP Los Baños and our agricultural universities that are now producing these wonderful science outputs. Well, it's because the institutions got it right. They launched into long-term variety improvement, all kinds of private sector development programs. Now, the people there, the institutions there were geared for the long term. R&D became a royally sponsored type of activity, especially for agriculture. So politicians can come and go, the juntas can come and go, but those long-term scientific programs will continue under sponsorship of the king. We need to have this kind of long-term orientation. And if we have this long-term orientation, I think the money will follow and the right investments in R&D will follow.
The question is, what's the science absorptive capacity of our institutions? That's one question. Because even if you expand your R&D efforts, but the absorptive capacity of institutions to make decisions based on science, their ability to use science as basis for policy making is low. Parang gano'n na nga na marang nasasayang na yung R&D natin. But be that as it may, assuming that R&D really gets to be, assuming that government is able to absorb science as basis for policy making, R&D would still be very, very critical. One example, for a long time we have had ilang-ilang, but we didn't do any R&D on ilang-ilang. Other countries did, so they are able to extract synthetics from out of it. How many of we have more biodiversity in our oceans and seas and coastal areas than in our land? Not much. But have we been doing R&D on the extent to which such biodiversity could backstop complements as well as components of our food supply? Food is not just what you immediately eat, but things that you can get from the environment that you can put together in order that you can eat it. So it's not necessarily yung actual harvest. So tingin ko, pharmaceuticals, fiber, how much of that? But if we don't have R&D, we will never know that. We will know that. So ito yung mga kinakailangan. I know that some of our leaders think that R&D is a waste of money. I would beg to disagree with that because if you don't know, you cannot do.
Let me just follow up on that, Ben. No? I think the Philippines, in terms of talent, has got nothing left to prove. We have been the host of so many amazing breakthroughs in agriculture. We were the ones who innovated full cycle aquaculture of milkfish. Sa atin unang nagsimula yung tropical genetic development of tropical fish, the gift tilapia. It is in our experimental stations na lumabas yung Green Revolution rice technologies. The first tropical flowering, artificially induced flowering, na imbento sa UPLB, si Dr. Barba, National Scientist Barba, yes. And on and on and on. We have so much talent. But after these giant breakthroughs, na follow up ba? Did the system pick it up and continue and push? Maybe we have field rice, that's fine. Pero all of these other na sana we can have pushed more and more in that direction and gotten more breakthroughs and innovations in all of our other product development, mangoes, pineapples, etc., rubber, commercial crops, and so on. I don't think we have enough of these. We are always looking at Thailand because that's really where they took the ball and ran with it, no? So as I said, they're the envy of the world right now in terms of their R&D. So we could have done that. Yun lang, can we make our institutions, our politicians especially, aware and sensitized to the enormous long-term benefits of this kind of investment?
Thank you, Dr. Roel. I'll ask the last question po, no? This is possibly for maybe Luis and Ms. Mariette. So this question is from Facebook user Monina Jingeaga. Considering the worsening climate crisis, how does the budget address the need for renewable energy sources and sustainable agriculture? Luis, you want to answer?
Yeah, so medyo malaki yung tanong. The way I'll respond to that is in relation to what our distinguished panelists have already said. A lot of the spending that we're seeing seems to lack an overarching strategic response to the reality really of climate change, diba? And a lot of the advocates have been so fixated on the headline amounts. And I guess the challenge really is to really look at it not from just the aggregate amounts, but from the design of the programs. So in terms of renewable energy, energy has been something that has a lot of it has been relegated to the private sector. So there's not much direct government spending on that. In terms of sustainable agriculture, yun nga, what was discussed earlier, na we're so fixated on seeds, fertilizer, farm-to-market roads, and we don't see the communities and the ecosystems and really try to identify how do we enhance their productivity at the same time, enhance their resiliency. So in terms of the governance structure, yung sinasabi ni Dr. Roel na hindi lang siya about the money eh. It's about how we design the interventions and how it's actually implemented. So to the person who asked that question, siguro rather than how much, let's ask how is DA trying to respond to that? And once we identify what that intervention is, the question then is how much money are they putting into that intervention? Because right now it seems like it's all about input assistance.
Thank you, Luis. Sure po, Dr. Well.
About governance, no? Sundan ko lang yung sinabi ni Luis. Back to my soapbox on separating regulatory function from development and in relation to cooperatives, no? We have a cooperatives development authority. So, authority siya yung nag-regulate under the cooperatives code, pero siya din yung may mandato ng development. So, nagre-reklamo yung mga cooperative. Ano ba talaga, kuya? Are you helping us or you're hurting us? Kasi magbibigay ka ng programa, pero iipitin mo naman kami doon sa requirements. So, are you, why are you raising the hurdle while at the same time, giving us steroids? What's the problem? So if you look at Korea is again another one of those, the Semol Undong and all of these village movement. They're the envy of the world in terms of cooperative development naman. They don't have that setup. The regulation is vested in the Department of Finance, similar to our SEC now is part of the Department of Finance. So they have to register just like a corporation, etc. But then that opened up unleashed the developmental force of the Ministry of Agriculture. So it organized a national federation, and through that federation, and it had a cooperative bank, so my financial institution, and from there it just ran with it. Okay, if you go to the DA now, what's your cooperative development programs? It's been we don't want to step on the turf of CDA. So CDA naman, how do you develop farm cooperatives? What is a farm cooperative? We have cooperatives. We don't actually know which one of them are farm cooperatives. Out of, say, 10,000 registered cooperatives, may mga 100 siguro na agri. But who will register as an agri? These farm cooperatives are mostly registered as multi-purpose. Kasi bawat reclassification ng function mo, magbabayad ka at saka additional requirements sa CDA. So, at the outset, many of them register as multi-purpose, and you're completely out of the radar whether you're mostly composed of farmers, fisher folk. So, again, because of the dysfunction of our institutions, we're unable to mobilize the real secret, the real dynamism that is inherent in the governance structures, in the organizations, and try to really say, dapat trabaho ng gobyerno yan, i-develop natin sila. Hindi, dapat enabler lang si gobyerno. What are the right institutional tweaks that we can have so that the government, with a little bit more, of catalyst and funding, can actually initiate or mobilize the real inherent dynamism that is in people's organizations, that is in micro, small, and medium enterprises, which is in farm workers and fisher folk. So this is the kind of thing we should start looking at, rather than, we need more to pour more money at the problem and hopefully that way solve the problem.
Thank you, Dr. Roel. Ms. Mayet?
Actually, we have really big potential for renewable energy, especially solar, and also in the island communities, the wind energy. We have worked with some communities wherein there were also already evaluations that the wind strength in those particular areas can generate energy to support at least the communities, ano. Pero yun nga the appreciation of the policymakers on R&D and on infrastructure that supports communities, doon yata may problema. I think the key for budgeting is, as Dr. Roel has already pointed out, understanding of the needs of the sector in particular and of the whole community in general. Siguro if we have if we have a good understanding of the needs of the community, then we can allocate a budget to address those needs, and then maybe the spending performance would improve. Pero more than this, the drive on, they understand the needs pero they have other priorities, kaya nagkakaproblema pa rin.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Mayet. We're down to the last part of our webinar. I'll be asking po, ano po yung final thoughts niyo before we end this session? I guess first po muna si Dr. Roel, Dr. Ben, Ms. Mayet, and then Luis.
Yeah, I think more or less I've scattered most of my thoughts through variety of my interventions. But yes, I think taking stock, this has been very valuable, taking stock of how the public funds have been used so far for the promotion of agriculture and protection of the environment. This has been really valuable, not just looking at one irrigation or rice by itself, but putting it all together. So from here, I think we can derive a more balanced or maybe holistic. I used that word already. Kasi very often, pag irrigation lang iniisip natin, yun lang mag-isa. And then before you know it, you want bigger and bigger budget. Hindi mo alam na pag lumolobo ito, you might be actually depriving, some of the other sectors. So it's important to really see it from a more, balanced, holistic perspective, and really try to rationally see that, the more you support one, you're actually, having less available for the others. So, but it also goes the other way around, right? So if you do this other thing, then you're paying less. So how do we as a society do that balance across a large variety of possible activities and functions and types of beneficiaries? It's a big challenge. We have a giant, noisy, representative democracy to be able to address that challenge. And I think hopefully Filipino people will rise to the challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Roel. Dr. Ben?
I think I would suggest that we put a really big ear in the budget to listen to fishermen and women and to men and women farmers on what they really need in order to improve their productivity and improve their well-being. If the budget has that ear, I'll have more confidence in that budget.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. Ms. Mayet?
Yeah, my take on this webinar is budgeting is not allocating resources on one versus the other. It's really balancing the allocation needs, balancing the allocation of the many needs of the communities. And if we if we do our best to address the needs of the communities, then I think this can help improve the status of the communities, of the farming and the fishing communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mayet. Luis?
Maraming salamat, Aika. Maraming salamat din sa mga panelists natin. Marami na talaga akong natutunan today. You know, iLEAD, our specialty is really looking at the numbers and being able to link it with the expertise of our distinguished panelists really enriches the discussion. And thank you for sharing your insights today. I think part of our work sa iLEAD is really trying to share not just the allocations and the amounts, but really trying to help different groups understand what the logic is behind those amounts of our decision makers, and hopefully greater interest in our food supply, greater interest in climate change will lead us, different advocates, different groups, not just those in agri, but also those in public finance, to come together and maybe have a more sustained effort in trying to reimagine and restructure the agri-environmental budgets that, as we heard from the discussion today, seems to be quite detached from the reality that our fellow countrymen nagtatrabaho as fisher folk, farmers, so that we can really come up with a budget that is responsive to where they are right now and also where climate change will take us in the future.
Thank you, Luis. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Roel, Dr. Ben, Ms. Mayet, and of course, thank you to iLEAD for doing this with Rappler. Thank you for our audience. We talked about a lot of things today, ramping up additional investments on the blue economy, asking ano ba yung logic behind this proposed budget, and maybe what can be done when the two chambers of Congress finally meet to talk about their versions of the budget. And maybe this is something, whatever that we've discussed in this webinar, will be will have a weight kung paano nila a-amend yung versions nila of the General Appropriations Bill. So for next week, the topic will be the General Appropriations Bill. It will be on November 6th, same time at 1 p.m. until 3 o'clock p.m. So this is the 5th budget webinar by Rappler and iLEAD. I am Aika. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.